without disillusion, without identity, and peaceful, free from fabrications. So today is the second day of the teaching, and so I wish to go through the text. So all living beings, all those who have minds, sentient beings, have the experience of pain and pleasure, and on the basis of that we have this instinct of not wanting suffering but wanting happiness. So in the writings of masters of Nalanda monastic institution, they give what are known as the four principles of reasoning. So in regards to the external world of things and the internal world of subjective mind. We naturally have the experience of pain and pleasure. So pain is something that is unwanted, and pleasure is something which is pleasurable. So these pain and pleasure arise from their causes and conditions. And then there is the principle of functionality of the things, and then on the basis of, and so we naturally have the pain wishes to have pleasure, happiness, and avoid suffering. And then there is the principle of functionality of things, and also the relationship between things. And then on the basis of these, we have the principle of arguments, or using logic. So all sentient beings, including animals and so forth, are same, wanting happiness and wanting suffering. But human beings have a unique feature, which is the faculty of intelligence, this brain, on the basis of which we have special intelligence that are unlike the animals. And therefore, we can actually think of past and future, have memory about the past and future, and we can also think about the future. A whole lot of thought processes can go on thinking about and anticipating the future. So with regard to the physical pain and pleasure, regarding these two, they are same as animals. Like animals, we also have them. But the pain and pleasure, which are drawn on the basis of our mind, is really stronger than the physical ones. So it's been millions of years since the living organisms began to evolve in the world. And human beings evolved around 4 or 5 million years or so. The sun, it's said that it's over about 5 billion years since the sun came into existence, and then living beings started around 4 million years ago, and Big Bang, when did it occur? Some scientists say that it's been 12 billion years. In Switzerland, there is this scientific, what is it called? The CERN, where they actually are able to check the speed of light and so forth. So I've been there, and so when one scientist actually described it to me, with really big eyes, He told me that it's been 12 billion years since the sun came into existence. A Big Bang happened. And later, in a scientific a meeting of scientists, one American scientist told me that it's been 25 billion years. So then I thought the scientists themselves are not quite sure about when Big Bang happened. So perhaps it's been 15 billion years since Big Bang happened. And 4 or 5 billion years since the sun came into existence, and then the living beings around 4 billion years ago evolved. So all these living organisms, living beings, when they actually living things, when they actually became supportive for sentient beings. Then there was a time when these living things became support for, or the basis for life. So when the Big Bang first happened, it doesn't seem to be the case that some particles were able to become a basis for life and others not when the Big Bang happened. But then it's kind of evolved later that certain consciousness. So in our traditional texts like Abhidharma Kosha, it is said that the living beings actually started with some heavenly beings coming to the world. And then they began to, in the beginning, they have their own light and they didn't need any gross food. But then later, some of them began taking some kind of a cream of the earth. And then the human beings like us evolved. So we need to think in comparison to the scientists, in comparison to science, whether these could really stand to the test of reasoning or not. And so we, as human beings, our body and mind then evolved, and we have the body and the mind is actually stronger, and the experience of mind is more intense than the body or the physical ones. And we have this faculty of intelligence with which we can think about lots of things. So, of course, we talk about hygiene, physical hygiene, schools, systems. So we are talking mainly about having good health without any kind of sickness and so forth. And so accordingly, we seek and help through various means. So since the mental pain and pleasure are more intense, we need to also think about the hygiene of emotions as well. So for our physical hygiene, let's take the tea and bread. So please take your tea, take your time, taking your tea. So we consider health care for physical health very important, but if that is the case, then the mental health, because it is more intense and having impact on us. For example, even if you may be physically sick, but if you are peaceful within your mind, then you can stay relaxed. Whereas if you are full of anxiety and sorrow and so forth, then even if physically you may be comfortable, but still you don't have you can't be relaxed. So the mental experiences of pain and pleasure really have very strong impact on us. So therefore we need to think, give thought to our physical and mental health of the two, the physical and the mental. So since a long time in history, because people thought about the mental problems and so forth, pain and pleasure, then people began to believe in something called religion. And so religion is something that exists amongst humans, and animals do not have religion as such. But I don't know about the non-gods or demigods and the gods have religion or not. So since we have religion, because we face lots of difficulties and because they are beyond our own control, then people began to believe in some higher power called God and so forth. And then secondly, as I said yesterday, the basic human nature is compassionate. Because of the importance of this, then all the religious traditions also teach compassion and love. So when we think about mental health and hygiene, just as we take care of physical health, just as microbes could cause sickness, and accordingly we take care of health by changing our lifestyle when needed and taking medicines and so forth to cure our sickness, physical sickness and diseases. And similarly it's the case with the mind, but you need to use your mind. You cannot take medicine to cure the mental sickness. So of course, keeping faith in a higher power such as God and so forth could help. But we still need to give deeper thought to how to cultivate happiness. And in the Indian tradition, there is the practice of meditation, and accordingly, because of this, there is lots of explanation of the mind in the Indian traditions. And amongst these, Buddhism does not believe in a creator God. And the Buddha himself has said that you are your own master, you are your own protector and guardian. So if you are not able to control your mind, you'll not have happiness. If you're able to control your mind, you will have happiness. And the Buddha says, sages do not wash away the sins of sentient beings, nor do they remove the suffering of sentient beings with their hands, nor do they shift their own realizations or but by teaching truth and reality, they help sentient beings to liberation. So this is what the Buddha has said, that he cannot gift us with his own realization. So because of unruly minds that we have, undisciplined mind, therefore we have suffering, and therefore we need to tame our mind. So in Buddhism, we do not believe in a creator God whom we can pray for help as such, but because of our own mind we have unhappiness, and so we need to know what causes give us, what are the causes for unhappiness, and we need to develop and cultivate those factors which counter these causes of unhappiness. And so we have the emotions, experiences of emotions and so forth, and we need therefore to understand the workings and the system of mind and emotions. Some Westerners have said that Buddhism is not religion, the English word religion literally, but it is science of mind. So this is true, because Buddhism is about transforming our mind, but not merely through prayers, but by using our intelligence, this critical faculty, and knowing what are the causes and conditions for happiness and unhappiness. So there's in-depth a search for the causes of happiness and unhappiness. And so the negative emotions are defined as those factors which, no sooner they arise in our mind, disturbs our equilibrium or peace of mind. And so this is called nyemong, or disturbing emotions. But it's different when you've become slightly disturbed through compassion, because with compassion you have a very stable basis of the mind, although you may feel slightly disturbed in the beginning. But with negative emotions, these disturbing emotions, it's different, because they arise rather instinctively without your putting effort, but compassion arises with effort. And so you actually volunteer to go through a certain pain when you develop compassion for others. And so disturbing emotions are those which disturb our peace of mind, make us unhappy. So even in non-Buddhist traditions, there are explanations of these negative emotions, but mainly they relate to those of the sensual attachments, pleasures, and so forth. So all the religious traditions practice or teach love, the practice of patience, tolerance, forgiveness, contentment, and also self-discipline to counter these unwanted experiences. So in the non-Buddhist traditions, where they have meditation practice, the Indian non-Buddhist traditions, there are practices to counter our desirous attachment to this plane of existence called the karma dhatu, the desire realm. And therefore, the experiences of the desire realm are seen as gross compared to the experiences of the higher realms of existence, which are subtler. And accordingly, these non-Buddhist practitioners of Indian tradition pursue the higher planes of existence. So I've been wanting to meet non-Buddhist practitioners. So because when I went to Kumbh Mela festivals, and I've been actually told that there are Hindu practitioners living up in the Himalayan mountains, in the snow-capped mountains, who do practice of the inner heat and so forth. So whether they have the very powerful experiences or not, but there are those practitioners who may have real experiences of meditation. And so it's important for us not just to know that there are people out there in the Himalayan mountains doing meditation, but it's important for us to meet with such people and have discussions with them as well. And so and then in the non-Buddhist traditions of India, there is they have this assertion or belief in an Atman or a permanent self. So on the basis of that, I mean, they believe, of course, in this because of the belief in rebirth. But in Buddhism, Buddha says that this clinging to some kind of independent entity called Atman should be eliminated. And within the negative or afflictive emotions, there are those which have to do with intellect and those that are non-intellect. So afflicted wisdom or intelligence, afflicted intelligence is the basis for the non-afflictive those afflictive emotions that are non-views. So, for example, there is the anger or hatred. To counter this, we have the practice of love or loving kindness. And then for attachment, meditation on the repulsive nature of our body and so forth. So they are actually those factors which do not eliminate these negative emotions as such, but they kind of counter them in the sense that they are reduced. And then there are those antidotes which actually counter the negative emotions and eliminate them. And then in the Abhidharma tradition, there are certain gross or coarser form of afflictive emotions which arise through some kind of a perception of objects. And then there are also those of the negative emotions which are subtler, such as grasping at some impermanence of life and so forth. But these do not counter our grasping at self-grasping attitude and clinging to some kind of an independent self. And therefore, in all the different Buddhist philosophical schools, they do assert that of selflessness. And there's difference in subtlety of the understanding of selflessness amongst these different Buddhist philosophical schools. So, for example, when we say that a self does not have any intrinsic or inherent existence, and when you are actually able to develop this insight and experience of selflessness in that sense, of course, they will not arise in you, the grasping at the self of a person as such. But then you may still be remained with grasping at the inherent existence of psychophysical aggregates, and therefore we need to overcome the fundamental ignorance of the. And so the 400 verses says that just as the physical faculty pervades or permeates all other faculties, physical faculties, the faculties of eye and so forth, likewise ignorance permeates all negative emotions. And therefore, we need to understand that of the dependent origination of things and gain insight into selflessness. So one factor which actually causes ruin to us is this extreme self-centered attitude, self-cherishing attitude, which creates lots of problems and unhappiness in us. The stronger it is with you, within yourself, then you also make division between yourself and others. So because you cherish yourself so much, you distance others from yourself. And therefore you have jealousy and sense of competition and also covetousness and malicious thoughts and harming others happen because of this. And then on the side of the view, such as the afflicted intelligence, and also those of the grasping at true existence of self, causes problem to us. And therefore, in order to counter our self-cherishing attitude, we need to develop cherishing others by seeing the shortcomings, the disadvantage of cherishing oneself alone from various angles. And therefore, through this, we can counter this cherishing oneself. And then the wisdom realizing selflessness is the counter force to that of self-grasping at self, and particularly that of the reality of the interdependent nature of things. And this can eliminate and serve as a counterforce to eliminate our grasping at a truly existent self. So on the side of the skillful means or method, we have the practice of cherishing others over oneself, and then from the wisdom side, that of the realization of the selflessness of things and beings, realizing that they do not have any true existence. So because if we are able to develop this wisdom, realizing the lack of true existence in things, we will be able to reduce the reification of things and mental constructs and exaggerated ways of looking at things, and that in turn will help to reduce our negative emotions, these disturbing emotions. As I mentioned yesterday, the understanding quantum physics, saying that nothing exists externally or objectively, is very powerful. So I've been wanting to have discussions with quantum physicists. So I have great hope, and it has not happened. But yesterday, amongst the Chinese from Taiwan, I met some quantum physicists. So I told them that we need to set up some time, set a time for a meeting with between scientists, quantum physicists from Taiwan, and then maybe from Hong Kong or then mainland China, and then our scholars. So I was actually expecting to have a meeting next year. So in quantum physics, what they say is that there's no objective existence in things. So I have actually thought before that the quantum physicists who actually really are convinced that things do not have any objective existence out there, maybe they have less disturbing emotions. Not just theoretical understanding, but people who have real conviction in it. I have actually felt that, thought that this may be possible. So I have not received any. I've actually asked people to check whether this is true or not. But I haven't received any information and message. But yesterday I met some quantum physicists, Chinese quantum physicists, who, because of their conviction in the non-objective existence of things, it has made difference in them not to have any perception or conception that things are either white or black. So if the understanding of quantum physics could be applied like we do in our traditions, to apply the teaching of understanding that things do not have any objective or true existence to counter our negative emotions, it seems it really helps. And it seems it helps to counter or reduce our negative emotions like attachment and anger. So if we could explain this kind of view on the basis of the understanding of quantum physics, then it can, of course, be shared with other people, because we don't need to talk about this kind of view being a Buddhist philosophical view as such. And so, having rejected any external existence of things, it doesn't really help to counter the experience of pain and pleasure that arise through grasping at some true existence of the subjective mind. So pain and pleasure, which arises on the basis of our subjective mind, in a world of mind, cannot be overcome through the rejection of externality of things as such. And we don't need to talk about past and future lives as such, but even within this life, I have always have this hope that academically we could actually make people aware of this kind of reality, that things do not have any objective existence, and to actually counter their negative emotions. So these kind of deeper understanding of reality of things, it's no use to actually apply them to kill other human beings. But if we could actually use this understanding and knowledge to counter our negative emotions, it's going to be more beneficial. And so I also I tried my best to make people aware of this, and you also, as practitioners, should also do the same. And I have had discussions with the Korean abbot. I have actually discussed about how to help the humanity through the practice of bodhicitta and the understanding of emptiness. And so I have also met a Thai religious leader. I had this discussion with the Thai monk. So we are all Dhamma brothers and sisters. So therefore, we should see how we can actually contribute towards the happiness and through compassion in the world. This is not about spreading Buddhism as such. People could follow their own religion, but to reduce, it's our common responsibility to try to help people to reduce their negative emotions, and this is something that is shared need for everyone. Now I'll go through the text itself. So Master Nagarjuna on page 2 called you supreme amongst teachers since you see perfectly. He states without cessation means, which means that cessation does not exist. And this should be applied to the remaining 7 characteristics just as in just the same way. Page 2, first paragraph. So he states without cessation, which means that cessation does not exist. And this should be applied to the remaining 7 characteristics in just the same way. These verses are a summary or a brief statement, and the rest of the Nagarjuna's treatise explains the meaning of these verses. So Dochepa means in a brief, as a brief statement. So moreover, these chapters provide multiple access points to the subject matter according to one's preference, and their order should not be taken as fixed. Objection: what is need? What need is there to teach depend on origination? the compassionate Master Nagarjuna saw that sentient beings are still harassed by various types of suffering. Thus, in order to liberate beings, he generated the wish to give proper instruction on the perfect reality of things and composed this work. For it is said, those who see what is imperfect are bound. Those who see what is perfect are liberated. What is the perfect reality of things? Response. The negative emotions like our attachment, anger, and so forth arise because there is appearance of things having some kind of an objective, independent existence, and then accordingly we cling on to such independent existence, whereas this is not the reality of how things are. So because of the appearance, we also cling on to this. And therefore, if we understand that things do not exist the way they appear, and then this helps to reduce the clinging to the how things appear. So, for example, we may be angry at somebody today, and we feel the person totally negative. But then after a week, when we look back in retrospect, we may say that, oh, the person was not as bad as I thought a week ago. Because if the person were to be totally negative from his own or her own side, then after a week also, even after a week, you should see the same. But that's not the case. And then when you become attached to somebody, and later when you hear some negative features or negative characteristics or qualities of the person, and then you will see, oh, the person was not as good as I thought. And so from our own experience, we can see how these negative emotions of anger, attachment, and so forth actually see things which are not true. And therefore, when you are able to see the truth, the reality of how things are, which are unlike how they appear, how things appear to us, and then it will help to counter the negative emotions, to reduce them gradually. So two people may have two different views, but then one may be more true than the other, because when we do analysis, deeper analysis into the nature of things, we will find that the other person, one person is right and the other is wrong, although the other person may be able to explain in a very kind of attractive manner. So what is the perfect reality of things? Response, it is the lack of any intrinsic nature. But for those who are untrained, the eye of intelligence. So the intrinsic lack of intrinsic nature means that there is nothing objectively or nothing independently existing, but then they are merely designated. So if that is the case, if things are merely designated, then how about those wrong or cognitions which see things wrongly? Of course, they may see things wrongly, but then that doesn't mean what they see is right as well. Although that also is designated by that person with that wrong cognition. But we need to also understand that to be existent conventionally, there are certain criteria that must be fulfilled. But for those who are untrained, the eye of intelligence is obscured by the darkness of delusion. If things are conceived to possess an intrinsic nature, this gives rise to attachment and aversion. But whenever dependent origination appears, or when the light of dependent origination shines, the darkness of delusion is eliminated, and the eye of wisdom sees that things lack any intrinsic nature. At that time, attachment and aversion do not arise for things that are impossible. Thus, for example, when the thought arises that the reflection of a woman is a woman, attachment is strongly generated in the mind, craves for union with her. But when one realizes that perfect state, that is emptiness, exactly as it is, the thought of women ceases. Freed from lust, one feels great shame, and one blames one's ordinary mind for generating lust for something that lacks any essence. The Bhagwan stated on many occasions, monks do not bring to mind the internal female organ of a mind. Monks do not bring to mind the internal female organ of one who is a woman. Because of that, Master Aryadeva also stated, as I quoted earlier, also consciousness is the seed of existence and so forth. An object is a seed of existence. So here the consciousness refers to distorted states of mind, which gives rise to faulty experiences. Objects are object-filled. When such objects are seen to be selfless, as we become attached or angry due to clinging to how things appear to us, then there is the attachment and anger. But when you see the reality, which is opposite of what appears, then these negative emotions of attachment and anger also subside. The seeds of existence cease. Master Nagarjuna composed this in order to fully demonstrate that things lack any intrinsic nature. And I also quote some verse or lines from the 7 Dalai Lama's writings. When someone is asleep, there is dream. And then there is also the appearance of the magical illusions, where the certain pebbles or wood, pieces of wood, are actually conjured up into horse and elephants and so forth by the magician. But nothing has any substantial existence. And similarly, so just as the dream, although you may have some dream, but they are mentally designated, but nothing can be found to be the objects themselves. And so similarly, in our waking states, we have all these different experiences, but then if you really, the Dalai Lama says that these experiences also do not have any intrinsic or independent existence. And therefore, when you actually look at your experience, and also nothing can be found to have any intrinsic existence. So when I was in Bombay, as I said yesterday, I was looking from the hotel window and looking at the traffic in the street. And I actually thought along this verse from the 7th Dalai Lama's Song of Experience of the View, which says that in the crossroad of these 6 perceptions, there is this hazy, deceptive appearance, but then do not cling to this true existence, but see things as being empty and remind yourself of this reality. And so although things appear a certain way, as if they have some kind of objective, independent existence, and then accordingly, just as they appear like that, we also cling to that. But then that's not how things are. And therefore, it's very important to understand the reality of the interdependent nature of things. So if Tathagata, who knows everything, sees everything, and possesses great compassion, and he has also already explained and clearly delineated dependent origination to various beings in various ways, what need is there for Nagarjuna to repeat their clear presentation? So, of course, the Buddha in the Perfect Inner Wisdom Sutras, for example, says that everything from those of the physical forms up to omniscience, including in between those of the objects and the parts and grounds and their results, have said that all these things are empty of any inherent existence, and therefore this question is asked here, what is need for Nagarjuna to repeat? And so the response says, indeed, it is true that the Tathagata himself has already explained and clearly presented the dependent origination, but now those who explain and teach such term as arising and so on are influenced by their common usage, and with minds that cling to mere words, they do not comprehend the supremely profound state of dependent origination. They think things in fact exist because they are described as arising, ceasing, and so coming and all coming and going. They think existent phenomena are permanent or annihilated, identical or distinct. They think non-existent phenomena such as horns of rabbit do not arise. Master. So after the Buddha taught the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, where he says no phenomena has any self-identity or independent self-identity. But then, as there was this risk of people actually misinterpreting this teaching, then the Buddha, gave the teaching of the Sandhi Nimochana Sutra as well, thinking, with these three natures, what are known as the three natures in his mind, and with their characteristics, the natures of which are imputed, independent, and then the perfect natures that. So, following the teaching of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, there were commentators like Master Nagarjuna who mainly focused on the explicit content of these teachings, which is to say that of emptiness. And when teaching emptiness, the Buddha actually taught emptiness on the basis of the objects such as form and so forth, on which emptiness is established. And therefore, the teaching of the profound view lineage came through Master Nagarjuna, and then there is the extensive conduct lineage of the method that has passed down from Maitreya to Asanga, and then passed down to us. So we have these two lineages and the Buddha says that what arises through conditions do not have birth, and they do not have any nature or essence of birth. And those who understand emptiness are wise. And so, regarding the teaching of emptiness that is taught in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras and others, the explicit content of these teachings are more explicated by the Master Nagarjuna in his writings, such as the Mula Madhyamaka Karika. And so, when we study Mula Madhyamaka Karika, then we usually say that we should first read chapter 26, which actually cover topics which are common, shared with the Pali tradition, between the Pali and the Sanskrit tradition. So there, Master Nagarjuna goes through those of the ignorance, that of ignorance being the root of our suffering. And therefore, to counter this ignorance, Master Nagarjuna has written the chapter number 18. Therefore, we need to read that after 26, chapter 26. And then the 24th chapter is the third chapter that we should read, which actually goes through the different arguments back and forth between the realists and the Madhyamakas. So the realists, Buddhist realists have said that if things do not have any intrinsic existence, if they are empty, then those of the Four Noble Teachings of the Four Noble Truths and so forth we cannot actually hold on to these teachings. But then Master Nagarjuna, in his response, says that you have not understood the purpose, the meaning, and then the nature of emptiness. But Master Nagarjuna actually says that things have no independent existence because they are dependently originated. And so this reasoning of dependent origination to prove that things have no intrinsic or inherent nature is very powerful. So with regard to this word, dependent origination, these two words, so dependence refutes that of non-dependence on things, independent existence. And origination actually shows that things arise through causes and conditions. So because things are dependently originated, therefore they do not have any own identity or intrinsic existence. So origination dispels that of the view of nihilism, and dependence that of the view of eternalism. So there are different reasonings of these different reasonings to prove emptiness, and the reasoning of dependent origination is said to be the king of reasoning. So because this gives the clearest understanding of why things are empty of any independent existence. Yes, break, sorry. Break.
Now question and answer.
Right now is the question and answer session. I couldn't hear the question, though. Anyway, the answer is afflictive emotion has no beginning. There is no beginning to life. When analyzed through reasoning, there's one school views holds that if you hold that there is beginning to our lives, at the same time, if you hold that there is no beginning to life, then there's more explanation, more logical support. So the point is, when we look at, when you think of what comes from past life to this life and goes to the next life, this continuity. So it sort of boils down to the subtle consciousness, not the aggregates, not the physical aggregates. So with regard to the gross afflictive emotions such as like desire and hatred, these are also there since beginningless times. By the way, these two, desire and hatred, they appear to us as if like they are there to support us, protect us, as like our defense mechanism. For our survival, we need them. So that's how they appear to us. However, but if you let them go, go on their own accord, then they create more problem than they help us. That's why it is important to counteract, overcome them. Now, according to science, with regard to love and compassion, being social animals, we in order to survive, we need a society. We need to live as a member of society. So, biologically, it is a necessity, it's a biological necessity to live in groups, and as a result, we become social animals, living in groups and community as a society. Therefore, seen from that angle, the basic human nature is one of kindness and compassion. This is a scientific perspective. And also from the scientific perspective, love and compassion gives rise to better immune system and longer life and a happier life. So the spontaneous, according to scientific perspective, our spontaneous nature is loving and compassionate. The first question, now the question. Actually, what was the question? Yesterday, His Holiness explained that everybody has kindness, love, compassion by nature. But however, we have like an instinct to kill small animals. And then this happens due to our natural this latent potential imprint to. So that was how the question came up. His Holiness says that, for example, small boys, some children, they instinctively kill an insect or a stamp upon a an insect by nature. Some immediately show love and protect that animal. So these are some has to do something with imprint from past life. Next is about emptiness and bodhicitta. And what if after the generation of bodhicitta, how one give rise to the understanding of emptiness? So my answer is, first whoever asked this question, first you study, do some study on emptiness and bodhicitta. Emptiness doesn't mean there's nothing. So if you think, on the one hand, Buddhism teaches about emptiness, there's nothing. On the other hand, it teaches about generating compassion, and the two sounds contradictory. It means you didn't understand the point. So in reality, the understanding of emptiness actually complements the practice of bodhicitta, and bodhicitta practice complements the practice of emptiness. Therefore, yes, if we don't understand that suffering is something which can be terminated, then you won't be able to develop this aspiration to attain enlightenment. So, because we can see through logic that suffering and afflictive emotions are subject to elimination, then we can get this resolve to overcome our own afflictive emotion and attain enlightenment in ourselves as well as in the other sentient beings. Next question. Why are we always sort of circling around, circling round and round in samsara? His Holiness says, because we are very happy, we enjoy circling in the samsara. Here, His Holiness, this is His Holiness just playing. His Holiness says, according to the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha said, first understand suffering, the truth of suffering. So, suffering here has different levels of suffering, but the most subtle one is the compositional nature of our human aggregate, our human life. So that is the subtle one, and that needs to be ceased, or rather terminated. So if that is possible, then it is possible to attain liberation. So generating compassion on the basis of this aspect of samsara, the compositional aspect of this, our aggregates and suffering, that is the main practice of compassion. So the other sufferings, Benjamin Lawson Shakin has said that these even animals like cows have this wish to get freed from the suffering, from the suffering which is called the suffering of suffering. But we as human beings, we should go for a more subtle one, that is the compositional aspect of suffering. So most of us, we don't realize this, and when we think of suffering, we understand more grosser sufferings. The next question is, in Dharamsala there are many Western students living here and studying. Due to His Holiness's kindness, they got this opportunity. In His Holiness's advices, His Holiness told them to study on Buddhist philosophy, but it is a very difficult task. Can you advise on how to do this? His Holiness says he has a Dharma friend, a very, very devoted and diligent person. And he one time told His Holiness, could you please give me a practice to attain enlightenment as soon as possible? And so His Holiness said, there is no such thing. The best advice is to study the Dharma, the Buddhist philosophy, and the Buddhist path, week by week, month by month, and year by year, and then once knowledge and practice increases. So this is just like saying a little kid in a school saying, I want to immediately graduate from school. So that's not possible. So one has to go step by step through the different levels of the study program. And the same thing goes with physical exercises, or those who are like tailors. His Honor said he sometimes sew clothes himself. He has learned that you have to be an expert, otherwise the needle pinches into the fingers and it's very painful. So everything has to come through training, and the same goes with learning, understanding, and learning Buddhist philosophy.
So what is the best way for me to repay my mother's kindness? Repay my mother's kindness.
What is the best way to repay our mother's kindness? And there's a second aspect to this question. Is there something after death? His Holiness says, with regard to... It goes there. Gomang scholar, ex-abbot, a great master, a long time ago. We discussed about how to prove, what reason is there to prove the existence of past life and future lives. And he was saying you have to think about the nature of the mind. And my own point of view, even like gross physical objects, like physical aggregates, they follow a sort of a natural pattern, like every moment leads to the next moment. And the same thing goes with mind. The first moment of mind transforms into the second moment, and so on. And the continuity or the stream keeps on flowing. But however, these different stream of phenomena, they being mind and physical objects, being of contradictory nature, they cannot mix or merge. Mind cannot become form, and form cannot become mind. So the two cannot give rise to each other. Be a substantial cause. This is not created by the Buddha. It is a natural phenomena. And for example, the 5 elements, like the fire, its nature is to burn. But now this is like at a grosser level. If you think of the very subtle 5 aggregates, it's difficult to say what their real nature is. Not really like burning. Fire's nature may not be to burn. So these are natural things. So my point is, consciousness or the mind, its substantial cause should be mind, and its substantial result should be also mind. Now, with regard to the 5 sense or consciousnesses, during awake state, when we are in a awake state, we can feel the 5 sense consciousness. But when we are asleep, the 5 sense consciousness are also dormant. But the mental consciousness is continuously there. Now, during the dream state, the 5 sense consciousnesses have become dormant. Now there is a more subtle mind which experiences the dream. And then when there is no dream, the mind, the mental consciousness becomes even deeper. Now in the case of like coma or unconscious states, the person has not died, but the subtle mind is still there. So, in this way, there are many different levels of minds. Now, finally, at the time of death, the most subtle mind arises, becomes awake. The brain stops functioning, and the heart stops beating, and the blood circulation has also stopped. And the blood stops running to the brain, and the person is clinically dead. So those consciousness that arise as a result of brain's functioning has stopped. But now, in India, for example, some Dharma practitioners, meditation practitioners, some even regular individuals, some people have, after death, the body has remained sort of fresh, hasn't become decayed. There's one case, one monk in Bandra, Maharashtra state, after that person has died. First, when he died, he was in a very poor state. He's physically very weak. But after death, his body became such that it became more like, became better, more fresh. And also our 100th Ganden Tripa, when he passed away, he stayed in meditation after death. At that time, I sent some people from Dharamsala with equipments to test his meditation state by using those electronic sort of cables on attaching on his brain's head like that. So they found some unusual signals. Even though he has already passed away, there is something undescribable happening. So some scientists have right now have started a project to test the state of mind of those people who are in meditation after passing away. But since this is, but right now the dilemma is we don't know who will stay in meditation after passing away before it actually happens, and so we have to just wait and see. So, but we do have the equipments always on, sort of. On standby, and in New Zealand, one Lama, this one Lama Tutin, at that time His Holiness arrived coincidentally there, and Lama Tutin has passed away, and he passed away in a hospital, and he was in meditation, and his body was in a very fresh state. Usually the hospitals remove the body from the hospital morgue immediately, but they have left him there. And on the fourth day, and later on I had a discussion with Langur Rinpoche, who told me that on the fourth night, the body was holding the, even though the all the energy, flow of wind in the body has stopped, the body has moved by itself, and he has his hands have moved, and the right hand, the left hand was sort of holding the second last finger in his hand. And so how did this happen? And he told Langur Rinpoche, wow, what a loss of opportunity. We should have immediately taken a photograph. So meditation state after death does in reality happen. So this is despite the fact that the brain has stopped working, and the wind energy, wind flow in the body has also stopped. Now from the Buddhist tantric point of view, there are the three channels, left, right, and a central channel. However, it seems like after death, the three channels, especially the heart chakra, where the mind is believed to be residing as long as the person lives, somewhere from there, after death, the energy is still there's still energy working, and the subtle wind is still there. And as long as that energy and the subtle mind is still there, the person seems to maintain the body sort of in a fresh state. So as long as immediately after that energy or that subtle mind state leaves the body, the white and the red elements come out of the body, like from the nostrils, and the person has stopped living. So this subtle mind, in Guyasamaj terminology, it is called the wind energy, the wind of 5 colors, 5 light rays. So there's an internal 5 aggregates, subtle out external 5 aggregates, and within the internal 5 aggregates also has more subtle levels and grosser levels, and so now the subtle mind. The most subtle mind at the at the time of death is sort of merged together with this the subtle wind, and which has 5 colors. So this body, the 80 gross energies dissolve into each other step by step, and finally it dissolves into this most subtle energy. Now, with regard to the transference of consciousness, power, now the person, a meditator, meditates on a syllable and visualize that as one entity with the subtle mind and the subtle wind, and then with the practice of this sound practice, hik, transfers the consciousness. And in Tibet, in the recent months, we have some cases of some lamas who have practiced, who are a certain level of experience with wind energy, just before death he said he wanted to do this and then passed away. So now what this all shows is that birth and death is mainly controlled by this very subtle mind, which remains until the very last, and the very subtle energy. So this subtle energy cannot be a substantial result of a physical aggregate, but it has to come through a stream of a sort of mental consciousness, like that. So,
how should I stop the need to constantly please others?
How to flatter or please others? I didn't really get the question. So if you do that too much, unless the other person is a foolish person, if the other person is a smart person, he will stop losing trust in you. Okay, that's enough with the question and answer. I have a story to tell you. In Eastern Tibet, in Eastern India, recently during a visit there, I met a politician, Indian politician. For about 5 days, 5-6 days, we became good friends. One morning, he greeted me and asked me, "Did you get good rest?" His Holiness told him, "I always sleep for 9 hours, and so there's no." After that, His Holiness said he meditates for about 5 hours. Meditates for 4 hours and then makes the mind clever and intelligent, and then he used that to cheat and fool people. And then that guy said he always sleeps around only 6 hours, and so that his mind is not sharp enough to fool other people.
So Master Nagarjuna has composed his work relying on logic and his scriptures to clearly teach the nature of dependent origination. So this reasoning of dependent origination is actually used to prove that things have no intrinsic or inherent or independent existence by Master Nagarjuna. The Tathagata explained and he clearly articulated dependent origination for this purpose alone, and it is inappropriate that Master Nagarjuna later clearly articulated it for just this purpose. So the objection, why do you negate all 8 terms such as cessation? Can't you merely state that is without cessation, without arising, without annihilation, without permanence? So, of course, the things have their identity and definition and arisal and cessation and so forth. But if you were to actually search for their identity in themselves, you cannot actually pinpoint anything being this or that. So the question being asked is that there's no need to go through these 8 different kinds of aspects such as cessation and so forth. And the response here is those who advocate an intrinsic nature of things hold that the 8 terms such as cessation they are primarily taught through the influence of everyday usage, refer to things that actually exist. Therefore, just those 8 terms such as cessation are negated. So too, anyone who considers reality or initiates disputes about reality raises such issues with a mind that depends on the meaning of terms such as cessation and so on. In regards to this, all things that possess the properties of arising and cessation are momentary because they arise continuously within a stream. This refers to things that are impermanent, which change moment by moment in their coarse form as well as subtle changes. And then Sankhya say both essence and person are permanent. Vaisheshika say the 9 substances such as earth are permanent. Also Jains say the 6 substances such as the principle of motion, the principle of rest, space, time, matter, and beings are permanent. So too in general they argue about whether life force and body, fire and fuel, cause and effect qualities, and those possessing qualities are parts and wholes are identical or distinct. Further, the Sankhya say those who possess the 3 qualities, action and jhana, transmigrate, Others say neither atoms nor mind move. And others say both, Jains say both being, jiva, matter, and possess movement. Once established, they proceed upwards. Therefore, the 8 terms such as cessation are negated due to contemplating reality and initiating dispute about reality. So why is cessation negated first and arising negated later? I think it is logical to state without arising, without cessation. So of course, when things do not have any intrinsic independent existence, I mean, they cannot have any independent arisal or independent cessation and so forth. And similarly, it is the case with the other characteristics. So in general, of course, we cannot say whether arisal happens first or cessation happens first, and then the other as well. But in relation to a particular object like a sprout that we see, and we can say that the seed comes first and then the sprout. So the response, the original order should not be faulted. Why? Because those skilled in language ascertain how priority is applied according to grammatical rules, but others do not ascertain this. An objection, if arising existation will occur, but if arising does not exist, cessation will not occur. Therefore, in accordance with the proper order, first arising must be stated. Response, friend, give an example that would generate conviction in your assertion. Arising is earlier and cessation is later. Objection, anything could serve as an example. How? For instance, it is like attachment. Birth is meaningless. Why? Because if birth exists, then enemies such as aging, death, illness, and suffering, killing, and bondage exist. Response. But something that whenever death occurs, birth must surely precede. If it does not precede death, then it would absurd to follow that samsara would have a beginning. But this is unacceptable. Therefore, because samsara has no beginning or end, it cannot be stated that birth is first and death follows, and death is first and birth follows. Also, it is stated, if birth occurred earlier and aging and death occurred later, birth would be without aging and death, and birth would arise even without dying. Objection. But if birth that is full of such fears did not exist, then meaningless harm would not occur. Just as if trees did not arise, the forest would not be harmed by fire or wind. This is an example, and response is, what is the difference? And the objection, there is a difference because something that arises after ceasing does not exist. For there is no tree that has ceased elsewhere, but then arises here. And then the response is, in this regard, since a sprout arises after seed or ceases, it only arises due to seed ceasing it. Objection, this is not similar. Why? Because when one has ceased, another arises. Thus, when the seed has ceased, the sprout arises. But since the sprout does not arise, when the sprout has ceased, it is not similar. And the response is, that is entirely similar. Why? Because both birth and death also are also like this, and the one who dies is not the one who is born. If the very one who dies were the one who is born, then it would follow that the person would be permanent, and one who is a god would only become a god, and one who is an animal would only become an animal. But this cannot be asserted, since rebirth and reincarnation produced by karma and afflictions are unmistaken. Thus you cannot assert just the one who dies is the one who is born, and this is entirely similar. Also here it is illogical to state just the one that ceases is the one that arises, and so forth. So the opponent who are actually making the objections ask these questions with the belief that if things exist, they must have some essential identity of themselves, often in themselves. If both the seed and the sprout were absolutely unrelated, the two would not exist as the cause and effect, even nominally. But since they nominally exist as cause and effect, those two are not absolutely unrelated. Again, in this world, someone may say, I planted the seed and I grew this tree, I produced a son, this tree is mine, the son is mine. But if the seed and tree and the father and the son were absolutely unrelated, such worldly expressions would be impossible. So even in the world, the worldly people will not use these terms if things, cannot use such terms to show relationship, because things exist independently, have essential identity in themselves. But since such expressions are possible, it cannot be stated that both seed and tree are absolutely unrelated. It is stated, others are different through depending on others. If others do not exist, others would not be different. It is untenable that something which arises in dependence on that is different from that. Untenable, yeah. Oh, tenable, sorry. Objection. Again, on this point, if the seed exists, it will come to cease. Since if it did not exist, it will not come to cease. Therefore, here arising is earlier and cessation later. So the last passage on page number 5. Therefore, since neither arising nor ceasing cannot be posited as earlier or later, why is it inappropriate to criticize the statement cessation is negated first, arising is negated later? Because it is clearly taught that those two cannot be posited as earlier or later. You should investigate why Nagarjuna here states cessation first and arising later. And then objection. First, demonstrate how the term arising is mere convention. We shall now. So the Prasankika Madhyamikas say that things like arising and so forth are merely in name. So someone asked this to demonstrate it, and the response, we shall now set this out fully, not from itself, not from others, not from both, not without a cause, never in any way does anything arise. In this regard, if something were to arise, that thing would arise from itself, or so just as things appear to us, if there were to be a seed or cause which independently arises, given rise to its effect, which also arises independently, and the arisal itself, the action also, if it has any independent existence. So just as appears, that is not the case. Or from others, or from others here refer to, for example, the sprout and its seeds being independently separate or different, and from both itself and others, and without a cause. So since things do not arise from itself nor another, they do not have arising from both itself and others, and then also without any causes. So the opponent's view is that things must exist the way they appear to us, as if, which is to say that things appear to us as if they have some independent objective existence. And then with that assertion, they're asking these questions. But if we examine these alternatives, none are tenable. Why? So when the term from itself ultimately means from its own self. First, a thing does not arise from its own self, because such arising would be pointless, and further, such arising would be endless. So if things arise from itself, a thing arises from itself, such as what the Sankhya say, that the effects, the sprout, for example, is a manifest effect, whereas there is also within the seed an unmanifested sprout. So they say that there must be some compatible factor for the sprout to arise, otherwise it cannot arise. So therefore they say within the seed that compatible factor is there intrinsically. So with regard to our body, even to the number of the hairs on our body, said to have their seed or some kind of a seed within the chromosome. So the different features of our body are said to have their seeds within the chromosome. And so the Sankhya's say that this sprout within the seed itself is called unmanifested sprout. Blueprint. Unmanifested. The chromosomes blueprint, yeah. So if the sprout or the effect were to exist at the time of the course itself, then the birth itself is pointless. So on the one hand, they think that things have some true intrinsic existence, and then on the other hand, they also say that the effect is within the cause itself as well, as unmanifested aspect. As such, things which exist in and of themselves do not need to arise again. But if something which already exists needs to arise again, then it would never not need to arise. But this is untenable. Therefore, first, no thing arises from itself. So this is the rejection of arisal from self. And so, with regard to this particular statement, there is objection from Bhavaviveka, Master Bhavaviveka, and to that objection from Bhavaviveka, Master Chandrakirti in his Prasanapada called response. So Bhavaviveka's lamp of wisdom contains that criticism. Also, they do not arise from others. Why? Because it would follow that anything would arise from anything. They do not arise from both itself and other, because it would then follow that both previous errors would apply. Also, they do not arise without a cause, because it would follow that anything would continuously arise from anything. And in consequence, the error that the entire causal process would be pointless would ensue. So if you investigate into the process of arising from itself or others and another, or both self and other and causeless, I mean, nothing can be found when you do search for this kind of arisal. So of course, in conventional terms, arisal and cessation do exist. Thus, because it is not tenable that a thing arises in any of these ways, the term arising is merely convention, since there is no arising. So in the Madhyamaka Avatara, it says that things have no existence from their own side, and similarly Master Tsongkhapa gives this reasoning. So when we actually analyze things, whether they have an own existence or essential identity or not, they do not. We cannot find such thing, and therefore we should not go beyond the worldly convention to posit things. And so there is this argument between the realists and the prasangikas or madhyamakas, whether there is the commonly called accepted object or not. And in Master Tsongkhapa's commentary on Madhyamaka Karika, he says that things do not have in the essence of true eloquence. He says that things either could exist by way of designation, or they could exist by from their own side. And since they cannot exist from their own side, there's no other alternative but to say that things exist by designation. And in the Madhyamaka commentary by Master Tsongkhapa, he says that since there is no other choice, we should drive our mind towards that insight. And then in his commentary to Madhyamaka Avatara, he says that to the assertion that things are merely designated is the most difficult point to comprehend in the Madhyamaka's philosophical tradition. So having rejected any and all object of negation when we establish emptiness, and having done that, then you will be able to see that things are merely designated and merely in name. Otherwise, until you are able to reject the subtlest form of object of designation, you will not be able to have that insight into the mere nominality of things. So, objection, we admit the first 3 points. Things do not arise from themselves, so how then could a sprout arise from itself? If a thing does not arise from itself, it is illogical that it arises from itself and others, since one part of this thesis would fail, and the proposition arising without a cause cannot be accepted since it is absurd. But you strictly maintain the position that things never arise from others. But how can this position be justified? So says, the objector says that the four conditions are causal condition, and the objective condition, immediately preceding condition, and the dominant condition. A fifth does not exist. So because these do exist, we can talk about them, they say. Since it is that a fifth does not exists, this indicates that Abhidharma masters strictly maintain that any condition, even those conventionally described as different from the four conditions, must be included within the four conditions. In order to fully settle the issue, these masters teach these four conditions, such as the causal condition, to be the conditions generating things. For things arise from these four conditions alone. Thus, because things arise from the four conditions which are other, therefore it is unsound to assert things never arise from others. And the response says, if you designate any of the four conditions, such as the causal condition, as other, and if they were something other than things, then things would arise from others. But it is untenable to say that they are other. In what way? The intrinsic nature of things does not exist in the conditions, and so on. If its own intrinsic nature does not exist, the intrinsic nature of others does not exist. Here, existent things may be described as others, since one thing relies on another, just as, for example, Gupta is other than Chaitra, and Chaitra is other than Gupta. At the time when conditions such as seed exist, then at that time, a thing such as sprout does not exist. Therefore, when conditions such as the causal condition and so on exist, the intrinsic nature of things such as sprout does not exist. If its own nature, intrinsic nature, does not exist, then how could the intrinsic nature of others, such as its causal conditions, exist? That being so, it is untenable that conditions such as the causal condition and other things such as sprout. So when we talk about something that is called other, there should be something in relation to which it is an other thing. Therefore, it is unable to state things arise from others, because others are definitely non-existent, and so on is stated in conditions and so on. So to reject this arisal from another is, in order to understand this well, we need to gain a good understanding of the Madhyamaka view of emptiness. And then there are those, because of the subtlety, there are those who say that non-arisal from other itself is also emptiness. Then objection, if conditions such as form and so on exist, then doesn't consciousness arise? The response, that is not so. Let's investigate the arising of things. If you assert that consciousness that has not arisen arises from conditions that are other than it, then how could consciousness which has not yet arisen possess an intrinsic nature? If its own intrinsic nature does not exist, how could the intrinsic nature of others exist? If the intrinsic nature of others does not exist, then sprout and so on would be the same. Again, there is an alternative meaning. The essential nature of a thing does not exist in its condition. It does not exist in those that are other than its conditions. Also, it does not exist in both. Why? Because to take them as conditions of further arising of others is flawed, for it is pointless. Thus, if the intrinsic nature of things exists in conditions and so forth, so if things were to have a rising or birth, were to have any intrinsic existence from its own side, then there's no need for us to say things arise, because it is already there. A reason. So we need to posit something that helps something in relation to that which is helped. So therefore, as long as there is an effect which is helped, brought about by that which helps to bring it about, the cause, therefore we can say the cause is there. So when this effect has arisen, and then the cause doesn't have to work to give rise to it. So, and when we do this kind of analysis, it's as if trying to find arguments, what kind of arguments we can actually make. So all these chapters of Madhyamaka Karika does this kind of analysis, whether things have when things are born intrinsically or what, and so forth. So things do exist, arising and so forth are there, but then when you actually check whether things arise from itself or others or both or causelessly, I mean, nothing can be found to arise from these factors. And therefore we can meditate on emptiness, and when we say Om Svabhava mantra, also considering them to be conditions would be pointless. That being so, it is said the intrinsic nature of things does not exist in the So, page number 7, last paragraph. So thus, if the intrinsic nature of things exists in its conditions, or those other than its conditions, and in both, then what use is there for something already exists to arise? It would be pointless to consider the things that exist inherently need to arise again. What use are conditions for something which already exists? Also, considering them to be pointless, what would be pointless? Conditions would be pointless. That being so, it is said the intrinsic nature of things does not exist in conditions and so on. Therefore, that which does not exist in conditions and so on has no own nature, because it can never be considered apart from them. It was also said, if its own intrinsic nature does not exist, the intrinsic nature of others does not exist. Therefore, if intrinsic nature of others does not exist, who can say that things arise from the intrinsic nature of others? What is the use? What use is it for you to ask what things arise from themselves or others, and so on? For the I and so forth are conditions that act to So here the act of arising is generated, giving rise to and producing it, that primarily established consciousness. Consciousness is something that arises, the I and so on, to accomplish the action of giving rise to consciousness, and so forth. And then the response, it is not that actions possess conditions. So it is said that things arise from conditions such as the dominant or empowering condition and so forth. And because there is the condition, there is also cause, and because of cause, there's conditions. You may say that because the eyes and so on accomplish the act of giving rise to consciousness, they are conditions of consciousness, and they also give rise to the name of consciousness. But if we investigate such action, then this is untenable. For how could the eyes and so on establish consciousness? Why this is untenable? Because we may ask whether, in your explanation, the act of giving rise to consciousness establishes a consciousness that has already arisen or consciousness that has not yet arisen. First, it does not establish consciousness that has not arisen, because that is impossible. Thus, the act of arising establishes an existing consciousness, and it does not establish that which does not exist. For consciousness has not arisen, does not exist. If it does not exist, then how could the act of giving rise to consciousness be something that exists? It does not establish the act of again giving rise to consciousness that has already arisen. Why? Because that consciousness has already arisen, and that already arisen does not need to arise again. So things, when we do not do this kind of analysis, whether they arise from self and so forth, and we can actually talk about arising, the action, the agent, and so forth, can be posited. The law of causality can also be posited when we don't do this kind of analysis into their nature of reality. But when you do this kind of analysis, then nothing can be found to have arisal or cessation and causality and so forth. And so why can we not find, when we do this kind of critical analysis into the nature of things, is because they are designated. And this actually counters our grasping and clinging to some kind of independent existence in things just as they appear, because clinging to this independent existence gives rise to the negative emotions, anger, attachment, and so forth, and then we disturb our peace of mind. But understanding of emptiness is the best healthcare factor, or the principle for healthcare. But if you think that the act of giving rise to consciousness exists for consciousness now arising, then that also is not possible. Why? Because not only does arisen and non-arisen consciousness not exist, but that now arising does not exist, since it has already been demonstrated that the act of arising does not establish either that which has arisen or not arisen. Therefore, the act of arisen does not exist. The reasoning also refutes the act of cooking. Thus, it is not tenable that actions possess conditions. But if you think that there is action that does not possess conditions, then there is no action that not possessing conditions. If in fact there is no action that does not possess conditions, for if such action were to exist, then all things would continuously arise from all things. If that were so, the causal and then there is an objection, and then response. Those that not possessing action are not conditions. Anything that lacks action is not a condition. How? If the I and so on are asserted to be conditions of consciousness, then since they accomplish the act of giving rise to consciousness, then it has already been clearly demonstrated that the act of giving rise to consciousness is untenable. If something does not exist, how could if something doesn't exist, how could that which establishes it exist? Because the agent that establishes consciousness does not exist. The I and so on and conditions that act to give rise to consciousness, if they are not conditioned, the act of giving rise to something, how could they be conditioned? But if they were, then anything would be conditioned for anything. If that were so, then everything would arise from everything else. But that cannot be so, because those not possessing action are not conditions. Why should I say that conditions do not possess action? Actually, conditions definitely possess action. How could they possess action? The response. This is applied in the context of stating not, for conditions do not possess action. How? Now, it has already been clearly demonstrated that it is not that actions possess conditions, and there is no action not possessing conditions. But if there is no action, how could conditions come to possess action? Thus, because conditions Conditions that do not possess action are untenable, since conditions that possess action also do not exist. Therefore, considering them to be conditions is pointless. And then the objection and the response. The verse, if they are called conditions, because things arise and depend on them, then for as long as things do not arise for that long, why aren't they non-conditions? If you say that they are all conditions, because things arise in dependence on them, then why not also assert for as long as things do not arise for that long, they are not conditions, non-conditions? But if you think that they are not conditions before but became conditions later, then that also is untenable. Why? Because in consequence they would become the conditions of everything, and this also is unacceptable. And then the next verse, conditions are not tenable for non-existent or existent object. If non-existent, what would they be the conditions of? If existent, what would its conditions do? If you say that the relationship expressed by the words that arises and depends on this indicates this is a condition of that object, then the relationship expressed by the word this and that should be considered to be either the condition of an existent or non-existent object. However, it is not tenable that something is a condition of non-existent or existent object. How? If non-existent, what would they be the conditions of? If existent, what would its conditions do? If you consider the conditions of non-things, then how would you respond to the question, this is a condition of that? If, in fact, it is illogical to say thread is a condition of non-existent cloth. Objection. Since cloth arises from threads, that is its cause, it is appropriate to say that cause of thread is a condition of cloth due to the cloth arising after the thread. Response: do you wish to entice a mother of your unborn son with your unborn son's wealth? We have said that things which lack conditions are untenable, and we have denied that things arise since conditions are not tenable. But you assert conditions are established since future things arise. However, things do not arise at any time or any place, even intermittently, for it is said, if non-existent, what would they be the conditions of? For you, when conditions exist, then things will arise later arise, and conditions are established in reliance on this. But how could this be? Therefore, it is flawed logic. But if you think that something is conditioned for something which exists, then it was said, if existent, what would its conditions do? So conditions are untenable for things which already exist. For how would the conditions act on existent things? It is illogical to declare the causal thread is a condition of cloth that is already established and exists. And then the objection: I do not say the action of conditions for that which has already arisen, but causal thread is a condition of cloth, since thread that is caused, that is, its cause, is designated as a condition of cloth that already exists. And the response: do you think that before you take a wife, your son's wife exists? The arising of a thing has been refuted, since it is untenable that a thing arises, yet still you wish to demonstrate its condition, a condition that has generated cloth. And then the objection: but for the purpose of establishing that things arise, it is untenable to say that one first spins thread and then later this was a condition for that cloth. Response: but this also is flawed logic. Objection: things are established from their characteristics. And a statement, a cause is that which establishes its effect, reveals the defining characteristic of a cause. Therefore, causes that possess characteristics exist. And the response, when no phenomena, whether existent, non-existent, nor existent nor non-existent are established, how could that which establishes them be called a cause? If that were so, it would be illogical. And the objection here, when phenomena are established by their causes, those which are established are either existent, non-existent, both existent and non-existent. And the response is, but this is not tenable at all. First, those which exist do not need to be established because they have already arisen. Why should those which have already arisen arise again? If something that already exists needs to arise again, it would never not need to arise, but this is unacceptable. Also, teaching something to be their cause is untenable, for if the effect exists, what would a cause do? Thus, those that now already exist do not need to be established. And the second? So, Holiness, when we are on page number 13, thus if phenomena do not have focal objects, how could their focal objects exist, and so forth? And then the objection. You wrongly conceive this through not understanding our textual system. So textual system, we do not say that that which has a focal object possesses the focal object like possessing wealth, but this means is that mental phenomena are objects established by a basis, and that is their focal object. Therefore, this clearly demonstrates that they possess a focal object. That is untenable, and the same response again applies to it. Thus, if phenomena do not have focal objects, how could their focal objects exist? Thus, if mental phenomena do not have focal objects, they do not exist, and they are not established. How could it be tenable that focal objects exist? Also, the term focal object of phenomena would never be actually established. How could that which is not actually established and therefore non-existent be an existent focal object? If focal objects do not exist, how could existent phenomena be established by focal objects? Therefore, focal objects do not exist, and also existent phenomena never possess focal objects. Immediately preceding conditions. Objection. Phenomena that has just ceased is condition for the arising of another phenomena. It is called the immediately preceding condition, and it exists. And the response, if phenomena have not arisen, cessation is not attainable. Because of the immediately preceding condition is illogical. If it has ceased, how could it also be conditioned? Those last two lines of root verse should be reversed. If it has ceased, how could it also be conditioned? So the last paragraph on page 14, cessation means non-existent. If the seed were to cease prior to arising of a sprout, if the seed was non-existent since it has ceased, then how could that seed be something which generates a sprout and the condition of it? Moreover, what is the condition for the seed ceasing? How could a seed that has ceased and is non-existent act as a condition which gives rise to a sprout? How could a seed that has ceased be a condition of a sprout that has not arisen yet? That being so, if you conceive that sprout arises after the seed has ceased, then it would follow in consequence that both states would be causeless. But being causeless is not acceptable. If the seed were to cease immediately before the sprout arose, then it would be established as the immediate preceding condition, because immediately before the sprout arises, it acts as a condition for the seed ceasing. That is also not untenable. Why? Even if it arose, How would it act as a condition if the sprout arose? And if the seed ceased at the completion of the act of giving rise to the sprout, then what would be the condition for it to cease? Also, how would it be a condition for giving rise to the sprout? Therefore, as before, it would follow that both would be causeless. And then the next paragraph, again, there is an alternative meaning. It has already been established that things are unarisen. Therefore, it is established that the arising of things does not exist, for it is said, if phenomena have not arisen, cessation is untenable. Things have not arisen, and if non-existent, the cessation is untenable. How could non-existent things come to cease? Because of that, the immediately preceding condition is illogical. Thus, because cessation of things is not tenable, therefore, an immediately preceding condition is illogical. But even when you consider that which has ceased, it cannot be immediately preceding condition. And then next is the rejection of dominant condition. Also regarding that which has arisen, for how could it become a condition? The meaning of it has been explained previously. And then the dominant condition, objection. The dominant condition exists, a dominant thing is dominant condition. Further, in brief, whatever exists and whatever arises and whatever does not exist and whatever does not arise is a dominant condition. Because things of devoid of inherent nature are not existent, the statement, if this exists, that arises, is not tenable. So this phrase, this existing and that arising, can be, of course, asserted and conventionally, but when you try to look for the existence and this existing and that arising, and looking for something that you can find as an essential nature of it, then you cannot find them. Here, it was mentioned before and extensively demonstrated later that an inherent essence of things does not exist. Therefore, having clearly established this, Nagarjuna declared that things are devoid of inherent nature. That's because the existence of things described in terms of the existence of things devoid of inherent nature is not tenable. Therefore, things cannot be described in terms of if this exists, that arises, and so forth. So, from the point of view of analysis of arising or of things, functioning things, whether they arise through the four conditions or not, I mean, ultimately, in the ultimate perspective, there is no conditions. So indeed, we cannot say the things conditions are established. That things which are conditions are established in this way, but conditions do exist. Why? Because effects arise from them. In this world, we see that effects such as sprout arise from conditions such as seeds and so on. Because of that, we understand they are conditions generating effects, since effects are seen to arise from them. Response: the effect does not exist at all in those individual or assembled conditions. How could something which does not exist in those conditions arise from them? The term "at all" means ever. As such, the effect never exists in its individual conditions. Also, it never exists in its assembled conditions. If it is untenable for you to demonstrate in any way that effects arise because their conditions are fully established, then how could conditions be established? How? Because the effect does not exist at all in those individual or assembled conditions. How could something which does not exist in those individual or assembled conditions arise from them? If the effect does not arise, how could you assert its conditions are established? But if you think that effects only exist in those conditions, then conditions are untenable, because if those effects exist, then action by those conditions would not exist. That is because those effects have already arisen and it is unnecessary they arise repeatedly. Furthermore, if the effect exists in those conditions, does the effect of multiple conditions exist as a final complete state in each condition, or does one part exist in each? First, if the effect is considered to exist as a final complete state in each condition, then there would not be multiple conditions. Also, because the effect would exist in each condition, then it would follow that the effect would arise from each without reliance on other conditions. However, if one imagines that part of the effect exists, that part of the effects and the effect exists in the condition, then it would follow that part of the effect would arise from each condition without reliance on other conditions, and this is unacceptable. Because of that, it is untenable that an effect exists in conditions, either individually or when assembled. But if you think that those effects does not exist and conditions, still it arises from conditions, and its conditions are fully established in reliance on their effects arising, then we shall respond to this. But if it arises from those conditions when they do not exist, then why doesn't it also arise from those which are not conditions? So Aryadeva says on page 18, if cloth is established from its causes and its causes also established from others, how could something not established from itself by itself produce something another? Thus, due to the reason that conditions are not established, self-established, they are not derived from themselves and lack an intrinsic nature. Because of that, they do not arise from conditions. Effects do not arise from conditions, but if you think that effects arise from non-conditions, then effects derived from non-conditions do not exist. If it is untenable that cloth is derived from thread, that is its cause. That is its cause. Then to state cloth is derived from herbs would contradict the view of the world. How could this be tenable? Because of that, effects derived from non-conditions also do not exist. Objection: conditions also alone exist. Why? Because there are definitely either conditions or non-conditions. Seeing that there are definitely only conditions and non-conditions, therefore grain oil is also only derived from grain, butter is not. Butter is derived from cream alone. Grain oil is not, and neither is derived from sand. Thus, because it is said that these conditions are those, these are the conditions of those, these are not conditions for those. So when we search for the essential identity of the cause and effect and so forth, I mean, nothing can be found within that designated object, from within the designated object. So this completes the first chapter called Examination of Conditions. I'll stop here for today. 오늘 건도 배워 쇼 이제 번 뒤지 제발 넘버 쇼바다 템바 뉴신도 이제 푸누신도 템바 유린네 베터시쇼 Through the coming of the Buddha in this world and giving teaching, and through the harmonious living of the monastics, may the Dharma flourish for long.